Hello everybody and welcome to another Quad's Eye View. I'm Ben. I'm here to give you guys a Quad's Eye View, me being a quadriplegic. Haha, funny pun on words, of course, as always. Sort of my point of view on an issue of the day. Now, today's one is one that I wanted to do earlier than I have, but was so emotional for me that I needed to actually stop and let it percolate for a little bit. So, for those that don't know, the Office for National Statistics in the UK have released a report surrounding COVID and what's been happening there. And I wanted to talk about this earlier, but it has been very emotional for me. And you'll see why very soon. So I've given it almost a month to sort of percolate and to think it through, but here we go. So the report itself, the title is the updated estimates of coronavirus-related deaths by disability status in England from the 24th of January to the 20th of November 2020. So what this is they're trying to take the COVID death stats in the UK, which, as a lot of us realise, COVID has been absolutely rampant in the UK. And what they're trying to do is dissect to see sort of what cross-sections are being most affected. So this is the estimates of differences in COVID-19 mortality risk by self-reported disability status and diagnosed learning disability status. Something to bear in mind as we go through this is that they're talking about self-reported disability status. Okay, so these are people who have identified as having a disability in their 2011 census. So they're using stats that are 9 years old. People's understanding of disability and the actual entire communities, in medical and otherwise, understanding of disability has evolved so much since then that there's a good chance this is much higher. But they also talk about the diagnosed learning disability stats as well. So anyway, let's get into it. They found that in that period, 24th of January to 20th of November, that the risk of death involving COVID-19 was 3.1 times greater for what they call more disabled men and 1.9 times greater for less disabled men when comparing to non-disabled men. And then amongst women, the risk of death was 3.5 times higher for more disabled women, 2.0 times higher for greater for less disabled women. So what do they mean by more disabled and less disabled? During the census in 2011, they had a question in there around disability. And if you said, yes, I identify as having a disability, the sub-question of that was, as a result of your disability, are your day-to-day activities limited a little or limited a lot? And so therefore people who are less disabled in their stats are those that have said that their day-to-day activities were limited a little by their disability. Now, I can see a few glaring statistical problems with that way of measuring, because if you have the right environment and setup around you, your disability can affect you a lot less or have a lot less restrictions upon you than if your house and home and surrounding environment are set up badly for you. It's going to restrict you more. So it doesn't, to my mind, that question itself is kind of really badly worded. But anyway, I digress. So one of my biggest fears as someone who would come into the limited a lot or, more disabled male part of the population The idea that I would be 3.1 times greater, or have a 3.1 times greater chance of dying from COVID-19 is freaking scary on its own. So when they were dissecting the data within there, what's happened is that they've actually adjusted the data to account for personal and household characteristics, okay, including residence type, geography, demographic, and socio-economic factors, pre-existing health conditions. So what does that mean? Your risk of mortality in relation to COVID has been shown to be statistically significant when comparing certain groups. Meaning, as an example, socio-economic factors, okay? For people in lower socio-economic areas, they are more likely to, their mortality rate is higher compared to those that isn't. And when you stop and think about it, it's because the people who are on the higher spectrum of the socio-economic area have more access to better care, better help. The same is true for the comorbidity factors. If you have other underlying health conditions, then you are more likely to pass away from COVID-19. So these co-conditions can be all sorts of things. And one of the comments that I've heard surrounding this particular release of data or these findings is that, well, of course, disabled people are going to die more often because they've got all of these underlying health problems. So what they've done here is they've actually adjusted it to take into account for these comorbidities. And by adjusting all of these intersections of different things and saying, okay, well, if we were to assume that, basically take all of these extra factors that people are talking about, people with disability, socio-economically normally disadvantaged, that they live in geographical areas or geographical circumstances that are not as good. So, whether that be living in council buildings in the case of UK, where the air circulation's not as good, or there's more chance of things being passed around, etc., etc. So they've adjusted to the stats to take all those into account. And even after they've taken into account all of these cross sections that have now been shown to increase the risk of, increase the mortality rate of COVID, even after getting rid of all of them, they found that there is still a raised risk of death that remains unexplained for more disabled and less disabled women, 1.4 and 1.2 respectively, and more disabled men, 1.1 times. Why is this? And in fact, this stat as well might be different because they're linking census data to people who have died. But since 2011, there are going to be so many people who have acquired disabilities or have had a diagnosis of disability that they've had throughout their life, or have actually come to the acceptance that, yes, they have a disability. They were told this years ago, but they don't identify as having it because they see identifying as having a disability as giving in or something. There's so many factors as to why people will put that they're not disabled on a census, okay? People with medically diagnosed learning disabilities, the risk of death involving COVID-19 was 3.7 times greater for most men and women. Even after they statistically normalised it, the risk was still 1.7 times, okay? Like, for me, it's 1.1, okay? And even that, mate, is scaring me. This is 1.7. They're adjusting for all of these things to be able to make a fair comparison between the two. So they're using the stats models, they're using scientifically and mathematically sound principles in order to normalise these statistics. And they're not being able to, because for some reason, people with disability are still more at risk. And why is this? One of my biggest fears as a disabled person, as a person with a disability, as a quadriplegic, as a human, as a member of society, is that if I get sick, if we were to have a huge outbreak of COVID here in Australia, and I was to get sick, then the subconscious bias or the unconscious bias of people in the medical system who have the power to make the calls around the level of treatment that I get, that their subconscious or unconscious bias is going to immediately assume that because I have a disability, that my quality of life is not as good, my ability to be able to contribute towards society is not as good, and therefore my life is inferior to others. And that's what these stats are showing. We have as much ability to impact society as anybody else if we are given the chance. If people stop treating us like we can't, like we're inferior, if they give us a fair go, how do you think we can go changing this? How do you think we can actually try and stop this from happening in Australia? So look, until next time, look after yourselves, look after each other, stay safe, keep doing the right things, and catch you next time.